This is World Sleep Day. It's sponsored by the World Sleep Society. The theme this year is quality sleep, sound mind, happy world.
Easier said than done.
Yes, it is.
We really wondered, how do you do that? So many of us struggle with this. So we turned to a doctor from Northwestern Medicine who really knows his Z's. He told us consistency is really key here, and so is listening to your body.
So my name is Dr. Justin Fiala, and I am an assistant professor of pulmonary, critical care, and sleep medicine at Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine.
Okay. And in simple terms, what do you do daily?
Yeah, so my job is really great. I am either working in the ICU at Northwestern or over at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, helping people get off of the ventilator after injuries to the spinal cord and other things that really impairs their breathing ability. And that's actually where the sleep medicine comes in, because it actually overlaps quite a bit in terms of how we support breathing, both overnight and during the day if people can't hold their own, in that setting.
Wow. So when someone hears you are a doctor that specializes in this, what is one of the first questions that you get? Even if you're just on the street and someone finds out, what is the most pressing issue?
Yeah, so it's such a good question, because you're right. Everybody seems to have, issues with their sleep, or at the very least feels like their sleep could probably be a little bit better. And so most of the time, the questions that I'm getting are, hey, do we really need, 8 hours of sleep or 10 hours of sleep? Because, those recommendations are all over the place. So that's a common question. And then another one is, hey, doc, I can't fall asleep. What can I do to try to, make that easier? And so usually that's the first foray into kind of, just getting people interested and really trying to ignite that spark that most people automatically have about learning about their own sleep.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking about, because in our shift in news and our business, we work really odd hours and falling asleep sometimes and staying asleep. Can you first touch on those two things? Because my producers, they came up to me like, we know you're talking to him. Can you please ask him a few things? So let's start with that. Falling asleep and staying asleep. Any tips on that?
Yeah. So when we're talking about issues with sleep, so much of the time, the issue is that we haven't been able to be consistent in our patterns. And so the way that we think about sleep is almost different than pretty much anything else that the body does, in that the more we think about sleep, the harder it becomes, right? And so to a large extent, the way that we can retrain the brain to accept sleep when it's appropriate is by actually being as consistent as possible. So if you're having trouble falling asleep, my first piece of advice is always to examine, what time am I going to sleep each night? How long am I actually staying in bed before I fall asleep? And is there a lot of variation kind of day to day? And even from the weekdays to the weekend can cause enough disruption where the brain kind of just gets a little bit confused and then doesn't, make that transition into sleep quite as easily. So what I recommend is to essentially, if you're having trouble falling asleep and you notice that you're spending a lot of extra time in bed before you actually fall asleep, try to reset that bedtime. If your body isn't falling asleep until a certain time, it might be that that's kind of its natural, bedtime and where it wants to be. So from that standpoint, you don't really gain anything from staying in bed an hour beforehand. If you're reading or just, distracting yourself and that's kind of part of your routine for wind down, that's okay. But otherwise, if you're kind of sitting there and stewing, we think that just actually creates more of an issue, where then you start to associate being in bed with, the frustration of not being able to fall asleep. And then that long term can cause more problems. So it really is going to be different for each person. But the more that people can kind of track their sleep, even, over the course of, 1 to 2 weeks, to get a sense for kind of what their schedule is, and then make efforts to make it more regular, that's going to probably be the most effective thing and will pay dividends, in the long term.
Wow. Well, we hear a lot. We often hear consistency is key. And so I guess consistency is also key in sleep. So
Absolutely.
One of my producers came up to me and said, my trainer told me to eat a spoon of salt before I go to bed to help stay asleep. And I'm sure there are so many things that people are told in this struggle. Are there any top things that you do tell people other than consistency in order to be able to fall asleep / stay asleep?
Sure. So I've actually never heard the salt thing before. It's interesting. And you're right. There are any number of, kind of old practices that may or may not be of any utility. What I will also kind of recommend to people across the board is, if there is an element of kind of racing thoughts, that are occurring and keeping people from going to sleep, which is so common, given everything with the pandemic and, what's going on in the rest of the world. If that's one of the pieces that's preventing people from falling asleep or staying asleep, one thing that people can do is actually carve out a time in the day, kind of separate from the nighttime. So what I tell people is kind of aim for the morning or into the early mid-afternoon, but no later, because you want to kind of carve out time that can be separate from sleep, where the whole goal is just to get those ideas out. So the idea is almost like a free thought, journaling, whether it's on paper or typing it out. The idea is that you actually do want to do something physical to kind of manifest getting that thought out into the world. So just thinking about it doesn't seem to have the same benefit. But the idea is, it's not that we're going to prevent those thoughts from coming at nighttime, but the idea is that by kind of having a place where that you can deal with these things during the day, it allows you to then redirect yourself when those thoughts come up at night, so that you can kind of say to yourself, okay, I know that this is a troublesome thought, I'm worried about it, but this is not the time to deal with it. Let's push it off until tomorrow, for our journaling or what we call constructive worrying session, in the afternoon. This is not the time for it. And so over time, that can then lead to a lot less of an issue with the sleep interruption component.
I can totally see how that would be so helpful. Because sometimes even if you make a to-do list, it helps to just get it on paper and to know, okay, I have
100%.
a plan and I have a way to tackle this. Like you said, now I just need to sleep so I can tackle my to-do list.
Mm-hmm. And then I think the other thing that I do want to hit on, because it's so common, is people will wear, Fitbits or Apple Watches or Oura Rings, some of these, commercial options for tracking your sleep. And for some people, that's fine. If you're the type of person who can get a little bit of extra data and kind of, take the bird's eye view and not put too much, weight on one piece of information, I think they're fine. But for some people with insomnia and long-term issues falling asleep or staying asleep, that extra data sometimes can be actually really harmful because it's just another thing to focus on and to get frustrated about. So in those cases, I actually say, if you're someone who has trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, you actually probably don't want a clock near you. You probably don't want one of those trackers on you, because sometimes that information just leads to more frustration and then just kind of a compounding worry that, oh no, now I only have 4 hours to sleep. Now it's only 3 hours. And then that can build and make things, even worse.
Even when I track weight or something, I'm typically the type who doesn't want to track my weight every day, because then I know myself, and I know I will, I don't want to say obsess about it, but kind of obsess about it and keep.
You're right. Exactly.
A pound here, 2 pounds there, so I can see how that was actually one of my questions, which was trackers. The other thing is about, can you catch up on sleep? There's this myth that, okay, if I sleep 4 hours, but I'm going to get 8 hours tomorrow. I guess that you kind of answered that with the consistency, but can you touch on that?
Yeah, but so that's a great question. And the answer is yes. So the technical term for losing the sleep is sleep debt. So the idea is that if you are getting insufficient sleep kind of over the course of, generally what we see is when we're kind of taking our history of what's your sleep patterns, right? We kind of hear that people might have a reduced amount of sleep during the weekdays, and then on the weekends, for instance, they're sleeping for 10 to 12 hours, each day. So the idea is that they build up this debt, right, over the course of the week that kind of keeps compounding on itself. It starts out with an hour shaved off on the first day, but then that's 2 hours the next day, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours by the end. And so then you have to kind of repay that sleep debt ultimately. So that kind of deep sleep that people will experience after, a hard week, for instance, and sleeping until 12, is kind of partially repaying that sleep debt. And so what we see then, for instance, when we read sleep studies, is if you're sleep deprived coming into a sleep study, we see that you get into deep sleep earlier and that there's more of it. Okay. We kind of see a widening of those percentages, where usually deep sleep is taking about 20 to 25% of your sleep. And then it might go up to, something in the 35% range. So the body does try to compensate.
Does that include naps as well? Would naps be considered filling in your sleep debt?
It depends on the length of the nap. And usually what I'll recommend for people is actually to try to not get into deep sleep during naps. The reason is because if you extend beyond about 20 to 30 minutes in terms of a nap length, then you start to get into these deeper sleep phases, and particularly what we call N3 sleep. And N3 is kind of this very deep, probably like what you would feel like if you feel like you woke up on the wrong side of the bed, you might have gotten pulled out of that deep sleep. And so the idea is if you try to pull yourself out of that very deep N3 sleep, you're probably going to have a much harder time. You'll be a lot groggier. You have what we call sleep inertia that you have to kind of work against. Whereas if you stick to that 20 to 30 minutes, you're going to stay in the kind of more superficial ranges of sleep that can still give a lot in the way of kind of midday boost of energy, but won't leave you kind of feeling groggy afterwards.
That's helpful. And I know right now we have just an oversaturation of information all the time, whether it's whatever it's coming
Totally.
from, we're just getting so much information. I know even working in news, I feel very overwhelmed often with all that extra added stuff. Then you add on pandemic struggles, people having a switch in their routines, and then you add on the world struggles that we take on sometimes.
Yes.
Can you touch on how that's just affected even patients that you've worked with, or just in general, how doctors that specialize in sleep have seen what's happened during this?
It's interesting because I work in the ICU, so I saw the pandemic from that side, right, from a frontline provider. And then when I was doing my sleep training, it was in the thick of the pandemic as well. And so kind of seeing both sides of it, right, where certainly, the pandemic was wreaking havoc on the patients who were infected. But then on the other side, for everybody who was quarantining and having to deal with, what am I going to do with my kids or my elderly, loved one that I take care of? And we saw this manifesting in, just huge waiting lists for getting people in for insomnia evaluations and treatment. So for instance, we will do oftentimes the intake. And if we realize that there's not anything like sleep apnea, going on, and it's a primary kind of insomnia issue, one of the best things we can offer is called cognitive behavioral therapy for sleep and insomnia. But the problem was that we need specialized providers to give those services, psychologists specifically, and they were very backed up. So what we really saw was this kind of outsized need in the setting of the pandemic, and a system that just wasn't, still isn't to a large extent equipped to, absorb all of that increased demand.
People talk about yoga, meditation, practices that can help you. How much do you think that can help? And is that a myth or is this true?
Yeah, I actually am a big proponent of various forms of meditation, as it relates to sleep. I think things like yoga that actually can be kind of anywhere on the spectrum from kind of low intensity to high intensity has benefits kind of across the board, where if you're doing high intensity yoga during the day, that generally speaking, will increase your drive to sleep then when it's time to go to sleep at night. And then if you're, kind of taking some of the meditative practices that come along with yoga and using those, for instance, if there's, some trouble, kind of winding down. I have lots of patients who either use, apps that help with meditation or just have their own kind of meditative practices that will make it a point to do, 5 to 10 minutes of meditation at night, either in bed or just, before going to bed. And people have had a lot of success with it. And so I think the way that I approach sleep issues for a lot of folks is, hey, so like, what are you doing right now? What's palatable to you? And how can we create, from the menu of options that we have, something that is tailored to you and sets you up for success, right? Because it's not going to be a one size fits all, type of a situation. But usually, if you can find a provider who you can pair with and just understand that it's a process, and that you might have to kind of try things and pivot if they're not working perfectly and try something else. But, realizing that to get sleep in a good way, is a lot like getting other elements of health in a good way. So like, for instance, if you're going to, try to get healthy and go to the gym more, it's going to hurt at first, right? Like it's not going to feel comfortable the first time you go back to the gym in, several years. And so, but that in order to get those gains long-term, you're going to have to keep going. Right. And so some of the things that we do in sleep medicine, things like sleep restriction to try to like build up the drive so that people who have trouble falling asleep can get to sleep easily. It sounds very counterintuitive, but it actually ends up being the thing that actually works long term. Again, because it's almost like most things in life, that are worthwhile require some sweat equity. And I think that's true to a certain extent in sleep health.
So the last question I have is, I feel like I hear very often the question of how long should I be sleeping in a very healthy, productive state? Does that vary based on who you are, or is there a standard?
No, it does vary person by person. And actually at the extremes, we actually know that there are kind of genetic inheritances that will actually predispose people to be kind of a quote unquote short sleeper. They just don't need as much sleep per night. And then on the other end, there are people who can get 12 hours and actually still feel run ragged and very tired. So most people will fall, kind of in the middle Goldilocks range. And so what we're generally, telling people to do is to sight in on what amount of sleep feels restorative for them, right? And understanding that you might not always be able to get that amount, at least making an effort to understand that element of yourself and try to match that whenever possible. And the other thing that I'll say is, if you're sleeping a reasonable amount of time, somewhere in the range of like 7 to 9 hours, per night, and you're waking up and you feel still run ragged as if the sleep didn't do anything, talk to a sleep specialist, talk to your primary care doc, because it really might be something like sleep apnea then, which even with a good amount of time asleep, if it's really disrupted sleep, it's not going to be good quality. If you're getting pulled out of it all the time, you're never going to get down to that deep restorative sleep that makes you feel good in the morning. So if you feel like I'm in bed, I'm sleeping enough time, but I still feel, like garbage, that's a time to reach out for, an evaluation.
Okay. I'm sure many people will take heed to that and relate to that for sure.
I think the one thing that I would add, just in the setting of daylight savings time, and then there's all this talk about, the Senate just passing the permanent daylight savings time, is that the data would suggest that might not be the right move, that actually the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and all of these other affiliated societies, they suggest that the closest thing to what the human body would naturally want is actually going to be permanent standard time. So it actually in history around the 1970s with an energy crisis previously, they tried to switch to full daylight savings time, like in an effort to save energy. And they actually ended up reversing it early because people hated it so much.
Wow.
So from that standpoint, I wonder where we're headed if this ends up passing. But what I would say is if people are having trouble with this switch to daylight savings time, one thing that they can try is getting bright light exposure first thing in the morning. So that's either natural lights, but that's hard if it's dark outside. So then they can use a light box that offers 10,000 LUX or lux, that's the intensity of light. And that can actually help basically allow the body to kind of realize that the day is starting a little bit earlier. And then it actually will end up adjusting the ability to fall asleep a little bit earlier as well. So it can kind of help in making that kind of yearly change.
Okay. This was so helpful. Thank you. I know so many people can benefit from this, so I appreciate you taking the time to share your
Oh, it's such a pleasure.
Yes, Dr. Justin Fiala with Northwestern. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.